morning had dawned with a fragile beauty, the kind of early autumn light that made the dew sparkle like scattered jewels across the sprawling grounds of Ashworth Manor. Yet beneath the stately calm of that ancient house, with its ivy-choked walls and creaking corridors, there lingered a shadow no sunlight could soften. For on that day the household awoke to a crime so peculiar, so utterly confounding, that even the most practical minds whispered of curses and phantoms. The trouble began in the West Wing, a section seldom visited, except by family and their closest guests. It was there that Lady Ashworth's only daughter, Catherine, had been preparing for her wedding. A bright and graceful young woman, she had seemed destined to bring new joy into the echoing halls of her family home. The night before the ceremony, a small gathering of relatives and intimate friends had filled the manor with laughter and warmth. Glasses of champagne had been raised, the polished floors had trembled under the music of a waltz, and the air had carried that restless expectancy which always attends the brink of a new life. But in the hush that followed midnight, the house slipped into uneasy silence. The servants extinguished lamps, the guests retired to their chambers, and Catherine herself was last seen bidding her mother a tender good night, before vanishing into the sanctuary of her bridal chamber. By dawn, tragedy had fallen. It was the maid, Clara, who made the discovery. She had gone with the tray of breakfast, a ritual on the morning of a wedding, to the bride's chamber. She found the door locked from within. This, in itself, was not unusual. But when repeated knocks were met with nothing but silence, alarm took hold. A footman was summoned, then Lady Ashworth herself, who, pale and trembling, ordered the door forced open. What they found within set the household into uproar. Catherine lay upon the bed, dressed not in her bridal gown, but in the simple silk nightdress she had worn to sleep. Her skin was ghostly pale, her lips tinged with blue. Though no mark of violence marred her body, it was clear to all, Catherine Ashworth was dead. Yet the scene offered only bewilderment. The windows were barred, the fire unlit, and the chamber's heavy oak door, so recently broken down, had indeed been locked from within. No bottle of medicine, no glass of liquor, no suspicious vial or phial was present. On the dressing table, beside her bridal veil and a scattering of ivory hairpins, lay only a single object that stood out as strange. It was a playing card, the Queen of Hearts, placed face up as though deliberately set there. Whispers spread with dreadful speed. A young woman, vibrant and healthy, struck down in the very heart of her home, on the eve of her wedding, with no wound, no weapon, no intruder, and only that card to mark her death. The guests murmured of poison, of secrets, of jealousies unspoken. Lady Ashworth, stricken with grief, clutched the lifeless hand of her daughter and wept inconsolably. The men of the household paced with grim faces, offering theories that collapsed upon the simplest scrutiny. A locked room, a sudden death, a card with its mocking queen. What did it mean? By the time the village constable arrived, confusion reigned. He was a practical man, unused to mysteries of any subtlety, and though he inspected the chamber with careful diligence, his expression betrayed his bewilderment. The windows had not been tampered with, the chimney too narrow for even a child to slip through, and the door had been locked in such a way that entry or exit seemed impossible without detection. There were no overturned furnishings, no signs of struggle, and no scent of bitter almonds or strange perfumes that might hint at poison. Catherine's jewellery, left upon the table, was untouched. Her trousseau, neatly packed for her new life, had not been disturbed. The constable shook his head gravely and muttered that it was a job for the doctors, though his eyes lingered uneasily on that solitary playing card. Speculation flourished among the guests. Some whispered of an envious suitor, a spurned lover determined to leave his mark upon the girl's last moments. Others muttered of old family enmities, debts of honour that had been settled in secret, but none could explain the locked door, or why Catherine should die without the faintest sign of struggle or pain. The physician, when summoned, could only pronounce the death unnatural yet inconclusive. He too regarded the card with curiosity, but offered no explanation. As the day wore on, unease grew heavier in the house. The wedding that had promised joy now dissolved into whispers and fearful glances. Guests began to look upon one another with suspicion, and the corridors seemed longer, darker, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the terror of the night. Lady Ashworth, though overcome with sorrow, demanded that the investigation not rest until the truth was found. It was then that one of the household, recalling a visit to St. Mary Mead and a certain sharp-eyed spinster with a talent for perceiving what others overlooked, quietly suggested sending for Miss Marple. By evening word was dispatched to the village, and arrangements made, for though the manor stood proud in its ancient dignity, its grandeur could not conceal the fact that a dreadful riddle had settled at its heart. Catherine's chamber was sealed, the Queen of Hearts still lying face up on the dressing-table like a taunt. The guests were kept from leaving, the servants instructed to remain on hand, and the constable lingered in the great hall polishing his spectacles and muttering about impossibilities. And in the minds of all who remained under Ashworth's roof, one question gnawed with relentless force. Who could have entered a locked room, taken the life of a bride-to-be, and departed without a trace, leaving only a card, a queen with her painted smile, as the sole testimony to the crime? It was the kind of puzzle that seemed destined to go unsolved, a crime wrapped in impossibility, too simple to be accidental yet too complex to admit of explanation. And though grief clung heavy over the household, somewhere beyond the manor walls, a quiet old woman with sharp blue eyes and an extraordinary mind was already making her way toward Ashworth Manor, summoned to untangle the threads of a mystery that would soon test every instinct and insight she possessed. The carriage that brought Miss Marple to Ashworth Manor rattled up the long gravelled drive under a dull and watchful sky. The hedgerows stood stiff and windless, as though nature itself had hushed to listen. Within the carriage, the elderly lady sat prim and proper, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, her eyes bright, sharp, and quietly knowing, taking in every detail of the grand but uneasy estate that loomed ahead. She had been here before, many years past, as a younger woman invited by Lady Ashworth to a summer fete. She remembered vividly the laughter of children playing lawn games and the scent of roses drifting from the gardens. Now, however, an altogether different atmosphere gripped the house, shutters drawn, footmen subdued, and the very air heavy with grief and whispers. The constable greeted her at the great oak door with a mixture of relief and faint condescension, the sort of look men often gave when they were not sure why a frail spinster had been summoned to matters of murder. He led her through the echoing hall, its portraits of grim ancestors glaring down from their gilt frames, and into the drawing-room where Lady Ashworth waited. The poor woman's face bore the ravages of sleeplessness, her hands trembling slightly as she rose. She clutched Miss Marple's hand with desperate gratitude, as though in that moment she had found a lifeline. "My dear Jane," Lady Ashworth whispered, voice brittle, "you must help us." "My Catherine, my darling child, she was so full of life only yesterday, and now—" her words failed, swallowed by a sob. Miss Marple, with her gentle fluttering manner that disguised a razor-sharp mind, soothed her softly. Now, dear, we shall look into it with patience. It is often the small things that speak when larger voices fail. You must rest as much as you can, for grief clouds the judgment, and you will be needed clear-headed." Her calm presence was like a balm, and Lady Ashworth, exhausted, nodded in fragile trust. The constable, somewhat uncomfortable at this intimate moment, cleared his throat and began explaining what little he knew. "No sign of poison in the room, ma'am, nor marks upon the body. The door was locked from the inside, the window secured, and chimney too narrow for any mischief. Only that card, the Queen of Hearts, left upon the dressing-table. Odd, if you ask me. Some fancy of the killer, though why, I couldn't say." Miss Marple's eyes lit with curiosity, though she said little. She asked quietly if she might see the room, and the constable obliged, leading her and Lady Ashworth up the wide staircase to the west wing. The corridor was lined with faded tapestries, and at its end stood Catherine's chamber, sealed since the morning's discovery. A faint chill seemed to cling there, as if tragedy had left its breath upon the place. The door had been repaired hastily, though the splintering from where it had been forced still showed. Inside, the chamber preserved the frozen moment of that dreadful dawn. The bed, with its pale canopy, held the impression of Catherine's body, though she herself had been removed. The dressing-table bore its scatter of bridal trinkets, a veil of fine lace, pearl-tipped pins, a bottle of lavender water uncorked. And there, just as described, lay the Queen of Hearts, unnervingly bright upon the polished wood. Miss Marple approached slowly, taking in every detail with a serenity that belied the keenness of her gaze. She noted the dust along the mantelpiece, disturbed in one corner, the faint mark upon the carpet, as though something heavy had rested there recently, the odd angle of a chair pulled slightly from the wall, too precise to be accidental. While the constable peered over her shoulder, waiting for a pronouncement, she merely tilted her head, knitting a thought or two quietly in her mind. She picked up the card delicately with gloved fingers. "Strange," she murmured almost to herself. The Queen of Hearts, such a symbol of love, but also jealousy, betrayal. Curious choice, don't you think? The constable gave a shrug. Could be some fellow she turned down, leaving his calling card, so to speak. These things usually have a simple explanation. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes still fixed on the card. "Things are often quite simple, if one knows where to look." She replaced it carefully and turned her attention to the dressing table. There was a small silver-backed mirror, a powder puff, and a crystal bottle of scent, nearly empty. Miss Marple, without remark, bent closer. A faint ring of liquid stained the wood beneath the bottle, as though it had been recently knocked over. She glanced at the veil beside it. It seemed ever so slightly crumpled, though the other garments were pristine, untouched. Nothing she said aloud, only a small, thoughtful purse of her lips gave hint that she had noticed. When she moved to the window, she observed that it was not merely locked but bolted, and that a thin film of condensation lined the glass, suggesting it had not been opened all night. The hearth was cold, the ashes from a fire long spent, though a curious scrap of paper peeped from under the grate. Miss Marple stooped with surprising nimbleness, retrieving it. It was no more than the corner of an envelope, torn, but bearing the faint trace of a seal. She held it up with a soft "dear me," before slipping it quietly into her reticule. Neither the constable nor Lady Ashworth noticed. As they lingered in the room, Clara the maid appeared at the doorway, pale and nervous, her hands twisting in her apron. She had been summoned to answer questions, and her eyes darted from Miss Marple to the constable with uneasy speed. The girl's voice shook as she insisted she had found nothing amiss beyond the locked door that morning. Yet, when Miss Marple inquired ever so gently, "And how did Miss Catherine seem last night when you attended her?" the maid flushed and stammered. She muttered something about Catherine seeming distracted, her thoughts elsewhere, before hastily correcting herself that the young lady had been happy, very happy. The contradiction hung in the air like a cobweb, fine but inescapable. Miss Marple, ever courteous, did not press the girl then and there, but her eyes followed Clara with a benign persistence, as though noting not only her words but the manner of her departure, the nervous hands, the quick step, the way she avoided Lady Ashworth's gaze. Something in that reaction, Miss Marple felt, hinted at knowledge withheld, perhaps out of fear, perhaps loyalty. The truth, she knew, often trembled just beneath such little cracks. When they returned to the drawing-room, the constable sighed heavily. "I can't see it, ma'am," he confessed, polishing his spectacles once more. No poison, no intruder, no sign of foul play, save for that blasted card. It's as if the girl simply lay down and died. Miss Marple, sitting primly with her knitting needles now in hand, gave a soft cluck of the tongue. "Oh, no, my dear constable. People seldom simply die on the eve of their wedding, in the prime of youth. There is always a reason, though it may be wrapped in the plainest of disguises. One must attend to trifles, you know, for they are often the hinges upon which great matters turn." She did not mention the scrap of envelope in her bag, nor the curious damp mark beneath the bottle, nor the tremor in the maid's voice. But, in her heart, the old lady knew. The truth of Catherine's death was already whispering in the corners of the room, in the misplaced and the overlooked. Deception had begun to show itself, not in bold strokes, but in tiny inconsistencies, the sort that most people never saw. Yet Miss Marple saw, and she knew that somewhere behind the painted smile of the Queen of Hearts lay a tale of love, betrayal, and something far darker still. Miss Marple began her inquiries with the patience of someone accustomed to peeling truth from layers of polite deceit. She knew better than to storm in with accusations or to demand confessions. People closed themselves quickly under such blunt force. No, it was always far more effective to let them speak, to nod kindly, and to listen for the little inconsistencies that fell from their lips when they thought no one was paying attention. The drawing-room had been turned into a makeshift chamber for these quiet interrogations. Guests and servants alike were asked, one by one, to sit with Miss Marple, Lady Ashworth, and the constable present. The atmosphere was subdued, shadows lengthening across the great windows, the hush broken only by the soft ticking of a clock and the faint crackle of fire. The first called was Mr. Henry Ashworth, Catherine's cousin, a man of handsome but nervous bearing. He was dressed immaculately, though his cravat was tugged too tight and his eyes flickered uneasily. He assured them he had retired to his chamber directly after the party, exhausted from the festivities. "I saw Catherine only briefly," he said, his tone hurried. "She was radiant, though tired. I wished her well and left her at her door. Nothing seemed amiss." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently as she knitted, her gaze lifted in mild inquiry. "You say she seemed tired, Mr. Ashworth. Yet others recall her dancing until quite late." Henry shifted, flushing slightly. "Yes, well, perhaps I misremember. It was a lively night." The small correction did not escape Miss Marple, nor did the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his coat, a peculiarity since smoking indoors was strictly forbidden by Lady Ashworth. She made no remark, only smiled sweetly as he left the room, his footsteps quick, betraying relief to be free of questioning. Next came Clara, the maid, still pale and restless. She wrung her hands and spoke in hurried bursts, eager to prove her innocence. Miss Catherine was happy, truly happy, she insisted. She told me she looked forward to the morning. I prepared her gown, laid it out just so, and she thanked me kindly. That was the last I saw of her. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did she mention her fiancé? Speak of him in particular?" The maid faltered, eyes darting toward Lady Ashworth before answering. Not much, ma'am. She was quiet on that. But brides are often nervous, are they not?" She tried to smile, but it was stiff, rehearsed. Then, almost too quickly, she added, "I had no reason to harm her. She was the kindest mistress I ever served." The old lady's needles paused for the briefest second, then resumed their steady rhythm. Over-eagerness often betrayed more than reluctance. Clara had been frightened not merely by the death, but by something she knew and dared not voice. The fiancé himself, Mr. Edward Harrow, was next. A tall, composed man with a voice that carried the confidence of privilege, he sat rigidly in his chair, his expression a mask of grief carefully arranged. "I adored Catherine," he said solemnly. "I would have given her the world. Whoever did this has destroyed more than a life. They have destroyed our future." Lady Ashworth, overcome, reached for his hand, and he allowed it with a grave nod. Yet Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the absence of true sorrow in his eyes. His words were correct, but lacked warmth. "She," asked gently, "And what time did you last see Catherine, Mr. Harrow?" His gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Around 11, I believe. We danced together. Then she excused herself to speak with her mother." Miss Marple's tone remained light. "Ah, yes. Lady Ashworth recalls speaking to her daughter closer to midnight." He hesitated, then adjusted smoothly. "Indeed, it must have been later than I thought. Time passes strangely during such evenings." The slip was small, but to Miss Marple it was telling. The man was careful, too careful. Among the other guests was Mrs. Lillian Gray, an old friend of the family known for her sharp tongue. She arrived in a flurry of shawls and indignation. "It is scandalous, simply scandalous," she declared. "A bride dead on the morning of her wedding, and no one able to explain it. I said from the beginning that Catherine was too trusting by half." "Trusting of whom, Mrs. Gray?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking softly. The woman sniffed. "Why, of that fiancé of hers. Charming, yes, but charm is often a mask. And what do we know of his family, really? Nothing respectable. If you ask me, she should have chosen more wisely." The bitterness in her voice was not lost on anyone. Lady Ashworth frowned, but Miss Marple only murmured, "Indeed, sometimes it is those closest to us who carry hidden shadows." Later, when the servants were gathered, Another curious note emerged. James, the footman who had helped force the door that morning, recounted how he had heard faint noises in the corridor after midnight. The sound of someone walking briskly, he said. I thought little of it at the time, for the house was still half awake with laughter. Did you see who it was? Miss Marple asked softly. No, ma'am. Only footsteps. But lighter than a man's, if I may say. The constable dismissed it with a grunt, but Miss Marple tucked the detail carefully away. By the time the last of them had been questioned, the drawing-room seemed thick with contradiction. Each person had painted Catherine as both joyous and anxious, both lively and subdued. Times shifted like sand. One claimed to have seen her retire at 11. Another swore it was past midnight. The fiancé professed devotion, but without conviction. The cousin spoke of fatigue, then backtracked. The maid clung too tightly to her innocence, and Mrs. Gray's resentment dripped like poison. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting, the firelight glinting off her needles. She let the silence linger until even the constable, fidgeting in his chair, grew uneasy. Then she said gently, People often reveal themselves not by what they say, but by what they are too quick to correct, or too careful to omit. It seems to me that dear Catherine's last evening was not as simple as it is painted. There are shadows among these accounts, and one must ask, who benefits from such shadows? Her gaze rested briefly on the closed door through which Mr. Harrow had departed, then drifted toward the stair where Clara had fled with trembling hands. She did not name her suspicions aloud, but already the web of deception was beginning to glimmer in her mind, threads crossing, tangling, each anchored to a hidden truth. The Queen of Hearts still lay upon the dressing-table upstairs, silent and mocking. But beneath the polite words and fragile tears of the household, Miss Marple sensed something darker pulsing, jealousy, fear, ambition. One of them, she knew, had looked upon Catherine not with love but with calculation. One of them had left that card as a cruel signature, and if she listened carefully enough to the voices of deception, the truth would, in time, declare itself. The rain began to fall that evening, soft at first, then steadier, drumming against the long windows of the manor and deepening the air of confinement. Guests and servants alike remained cloistered within, the sense of unease spreading like a contagion. The constable fretted, feeling the weight of unanswered questions, while Lady Ashworth moved ghost-like through the halls, her grief casting a shadow over every conversation. And in the drawing-room Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, her mind working far more actively than her hands. She had now heard enough to know that every soul under Ashworth's roof carried a motive, though none fit the puzzle entire. Each story overlapped, yet left holes where truth should have lain. It was, to her practised eye, a maze of human frailty, greed, jealousy and fear, all of which could drive a person to dreadful acts. But which thread bound itself most closely to Catherine's fate? That was the riddle she must untangle. Henry Ashworth, the cousin, had the most obvious worldly motive. Catherine's marriage would have secured the manor's inheritance to another branch of the family, reducing Henry's share considerably. Miss Marple had quietly inquired with Lady Ashworth, who, weary as she was, confirmed that Henry's debts were considerable and his creditors persistent. Money troubles often bred desperation. And yet, she reflected, Henry's nervousness seemed rooted less in guilt than in fear of being suspected. He was weak, foolish, but not necessarily murderous. Clara, the maid, was another matter. The girl's trembling eagerness to defend herself suggested she knew something more than she admitted. Servants saw and heard far more than families imagined, and Miss Marple sensed that Clara had glimpsed a truth too dangerous to reveal. But would a maid, who clearly adored her mistress, have reason to strike her down? Jealousy of the bride's fortune, perhaps, or fear of some secret being exposed? It was possible, though the old lady suspected Clara's silence came from loyalty rather than malice. Edward Harrow, the fiancé, stood at the heart of suspicion. His grief seemed practised, his affection more a role than a reality. Rumour had it, murmured Mrs. Gray with relish, that his investments were faltering, and marriage into the Ashworth fortune would have steadied his prospects. If Catherine had discovered this, or worse, if she had begun to doubt the match, then Edward's golden future would have threatened to slip through his fingers. And there was the slip in his recollection of the evening, too careless for a man otherwise precise. Yet to poison his bride-to-be in her locked chamber and to leave behind a theatrical card, that smacked more of drama than cold calculation. Edward, she thought, liked appearances, but murder required a deeper nerve. Mrs. Grey herself could not be discounted. Bitterness often masked envy, and her words against Edward carried a venom too sharp to be merely protective. Had she wished to prevent the marriage by any means? It seemed unlikely she had the opportunity, yet spite had driven many a hand to cruelty before. Miss Marple considered that Mrs. Grey might have known of intrigues in Catherine's circle, secrets she had not yet disclosed fully, perhaps saving them as a weapon. Then there were the faint, forgotten details. James the footman hearing footsteps after midnight, lighter than a man's, suggesting perhaps a woman moved through the corridor in secrecy. And the torn scrap of envelope Miss Marple had retrieved from Catherine's hearth. What message had been burned, and why? A letter from a lover, a warning, or a threat? Such fragments often proved the heart of the matter. She sat, needles clicking softly, and considered the web as a whole. Every line pointed to Catherine herself, her choices, her secrets, her relationships. It was she who had stood at the centre of greed, envy, and fear. To one, she was inheritance lost; to another, a lifeline gained; to a third, perhaps a rival or a pawn. Miss Marple knew well that behind a charming face or a loyal smile lay the full spectrum of human frailty. The constable, impatient, muttered that the case was all smoke and shadows. "Everyone had some reason, if you look at it that way," he said, pacing the hearthrug, "but no reason that explains how she died in a locked room with no mark on her. If it was poison, where's the glass? If it was suffocation, why no sign? I'll wager it was some weak heart, sudden-like, and that card a cruel prank." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her eyes were thoughtful. "Oh, no, my dear sir. Hearts may fail, but seldom in such dramatic company. As for the card, human beings often show themselves in flourishes. It is the small vanities that betray us." She allowed her mind to wander briefly to the oddities she had marked. The perfume bottle with the damp ring beneath it. Had Catherine knocked it over in distress? Or had someone tampered with it? A scent bottle could contain more than fragrance. If so, the poison might not lie in a glass, but in something as intimate as the veil or gown she wore, brushed lightly with death beneath the guise of lavender. It was a dreadful thought, but one she tucked away for later testing. And the Queen of Hearts itself? Why that card and no other? To mock the bride's role as beloved, to hint at betrayal in love. Or perhaps it was not a message to the household at all, but to someone outside, a private signal, recognisable only to one person. Such tokens, Miss Marple knew, were seldom random. When Lady Ashworth returned, weary but determined, she spoke of Catherine's state the night before. "She did seem distracted," she admitted reluctantly. "She smiled, she laughed, but beneath it I felt some anxiety. I thought it no more than bridal nerves, but perhaps she was troubled." Miss Marple nodded gently. A bride on the cusp of her new life ought to be radiant, not anxious. Did she ever confide in you, dear, about her heart's true inclination? Lady Ashworth hesitated, then shook her head. She never spoke against Edward, but she was not as giddy as one imagines. I thought her merely dignified. The words confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion. Catherine had carried a secret into her last night, one that touched more than just her marriage. That secret, and its discovery, had likely led her to death. The rain lashed harder against the windows, as if echoing the turbulence within the house. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting, folded her hands, and said softly, "We are in a maze, my dear friends, where every turn leads us to another motive. Yet no path runs straight. Greed, jealousy, fear, they all play their parts. But somewhere here, among these overlapping shadows, lies the single thread that binds it all. We must only find it." Her words lingered in the silence, and though no one spoke, all present felt the chill of truth in them. In Ashworth Manor, beneath its gilded ceilings and rain-battered walls, deception wound its way like ivy, binding each inhabitant in suspicion, and Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and gentle hands, was already searching for the one knot that, once pulled, would unravel the entire tangle. The storm had blown itself weary by morning, leaving the manor washed clean but no less tense. The servants moved in stiff silence, the guests clustered in anxious whispers, and the constable, bleary-eyed from a night with little sleep, seemed more determined than ever to bring the affair to an end. And then, as if the weather itself had delivered it, a piece of evidence surfaced that promised to do just that. It was James, the young footman, who brought it. In tidying the corridor outside Catherine's chamber, he had found something half-kicked beneath a cabinet, a small vial, its glass cloudy and cork still tight. He presented it to the constable with trembling hands, stammering that he had never seen it before. The constable, puffing with sudden energy, uncorked it and took the faintest whiff. His face contorted. "Poison, sure as daylight," he announced. "Smells like bitter almonds, that does. Cyanide, if I know my stuff. This must have been slipped to the young lady in drink or perfume, then hidden here in haste. Whoever left this behind was careless." The effect was immediate. The household erupted in murmurs, fearful and accusatory, while Lady Ashworth clutched her handkerchief to her lips as though the very word poison were an assault. The constable wasted no time in declaring that the culprit must be within reach. Miss Marple, however, sat quite still, her eyes fixed not on the vial but on the faces around her. Clara, the maid, had gone pale as parchment. Henry Ashworth's hand shook visibly as he reached for his watch-chain. Edward Harrow remained composed, but too composed, the sort of calm that one practised. Mrs. Gray, on the other hand, fairly glowed with vindication, her sharp voice cutting the hush. "I said it all along," she declared. "That man Harrow, he had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Poison, you see. A gentleman's crime, tidy and without blood. He knew Catherine might draw back from him, and he took steps to ensure she could not." The constable latched onto the theory at once. "Indeed, ma'am, you're right. Mr. Harrow had the most to benefit. He was the last seen with her, and here's the poison to prove it. I'll have him taken into custody before the day is out." Miss Marple, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, spoke with her usual mildness. "It would seem very neat, wouldn't it? Too neat, perhaps. But one must be careful with neatness. It often hides untidiness beneath." The constable, impatient, waved her off. "Begging your pardon, miss, but we can't afford riddles. The evidence is plain. We've the poison, we've the motive, and we've the man. It's solved." Edward Harrow was summoned at once, and though he protested fiercely, his voice ringing with indignant outrage, his words fell on deaf ears. "I loved her," he insisted. "You think I'd take her life when all I wanted was to share it? This is madness." Yet the constable clapped him firmly on the shoulder and declared he would be escorted to the station before evening. To many in the room, it felt like resolution. Lady Ashworth wept anew, but with a strange relief, as though believing the monster had been unmasked. Mrs. Gray nodded in grim satisfaction, and even Henry muttered that justice was being served. The manor, so long burdened by unease, seemed to exhale, but not Miss Marple. She watched, her expression serene, her mind alight, for she knew that truth seldom arrived on so convenient a timetable, and murderers were not in the habit of leaving their poisons neatly under cabinets for footmen to find. The vial was evidence, yes, but whether of guilt or of a planted trail was another matter entirely. That afternoon, while the constable busied himself with paperwork, Miss Marple wandered quietly through the manor. She paused in Catherine's chamber, gazing once more at the dressing-table. The perfume bottle, the veil, the card, all remained as before. She bent close to the faint stain beneath the scent bottle, inhaling delicately. There, beneath the lavender, lingered a sharper note, bitter and acrid. Her suspicion deepened. Poison, yes, but not necessarily from the vial. Later, in the servants' hall, she found Clara alone, folding linens with hands that shook. Miss Marple sat beside her, her voice soft and almost conspiratorial. "My dear, you're frightened, not only by the death, but by what you know. I dare say you saw something or heard something last night that troubles you still." Clara's eyes filled with tears. I shouldn't say. It would ruin everything, and if it were known, I'd be turned out." Miss Marple patted her hand. "The truth, my dear, ruins nothing but lies. If you speak it, you may save more harm than you can imagine." The girl hesitated, then whispered, "I heard them. Mr. Harrow and Miss Catherine. They quarrelled. Not loudly, but I heard her voice. Sharp, unlike her. She said she could not go through with it, that she would rather die than bind herself. Then she slammed her door. That was after midnight. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly, her expression unchanged. So Catherine had been on the brink of breaking the engagement. That alone shifted the balance of motives, and it cast a darker light on the playing card, the Queen of Hearts, not as a taunt, but perhaps as a symbol of control, of a love that must not be lost. But still, Miss Marple thought, if Edward Harrow had truly poisoned Catherine, why would he leave behind the incriminating vial? Why would a careful man, desperate to preserve his future, take so reckless a risk? And why had the vial been found so conveniently, after an entire night of searching? No, it did not sit right. By evening the constable had prepared to escort Mr. Harrow away, and the household gathered to witness the grim affair. Harrow, his jaw set, looked every inch the wrong gentleman, yet his protests were drowned by the constable's authority. Lady Ashworth clung to her shawl, eyes closed as if bracing against fresh pain. Mrs. Grey stood triumphant. Miss Marple, however, leaned gently toward the constable before he led Harrow out. "Do keep him close, my dear, but do not imagine your work is done. You see, murderers seldom reveal themselves so swiftly. The true hand here is patient, clever, and still among us." The constable frowned, but there was unease in his eyes. Miss Marple's reputation was not lightly dismissed, even when cloaked in gentleness. And so the case seemed solved, at least to the eager and the weary. Yet, in the quiet corners of Ashworth Manor, where secrets lay heavy as dust, the real culprit remained hidden, watching, perhaps even smiling, as another man bore the blame. The Queen of Hearts still mocked from the dressing-table, her painted smile daring them all to believe the game was won. But Miss Marple knew better. The game was far from over. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. Though the manor had quieted under the steady tapping of rain and the occasional crack of a distant branch against the roof, her mind was alert, sifting through conversations, gestures, and minutiae she had quietly collected. The vial, the Queen of Hearts, the maid's tremor, the fiancé's rehearsed grief, all lingered in her thoughts like scattered puzzle pieces. But there was one element that gnawed more persistently, a fleeting reference made by Mrs. Grey, spoken almost in passing, during her interview the previous evening. Something about old debts and long-forgotten slights. At the time, it had seemed little more than the embittered mutterings of a gossipy friend. Now it demanded attention. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had requested the household gather once more, under the pretence of reviewing timelines and alibis, though in truth she sought to observe interactions in a way that might reveal the unseen ties linking them. The constable, weary yet willing to indulge her method, watched with an impatient eye. She began with questions aimed at the more minor players, the servants, who often remembered details that the important guest overlooked. Clara, the maid, had calmed slightly, but her hand still betrayed a nervous flutter. "My dear," Miss Marple began, "tell me again of the night before. Not about the quarrel alone, but the small things, visitors, notes, anything that struck your attention." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "There was a man, ma'am. I didn't see him properly, but he came very late after the party was over. He did not speak with anyone but Mrs. Grey, and he left as quietly as he arrived. I thought it was some distant relative." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Do you recall his appearance?" "I only saw a silhouette, ma'am. Tall, broad shoulders. I know nothing else. I did not recognize him." It was enough. Miss Marple leaned back, eyes narrowing. There was a visitor, hidden in plain sight, linked to Mrs. Grey, and Mrs. Grey herself, so keen to point suspicion at Edward Harrow, had not mentioned this man at all. Turning her attention to the guests, she asked casually, "Mrs. Grey, you mentioned long-forgotten debts last night. Would you care to elaborate?" The older woman's sharp eyes flickered, and her lip curled in mild annoyance. "What I said is of no concern," she replied quickly. "Matters of old families and old grievances, hardly relevant to young Catherine's misfortune." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but old grievances have a habit of reaching into the present, don't they?" Sometimes they walk quietly behind us, influencing events we might otherwise believe accidental. Mrs. Gray stiffened, and Miss Marple made a quiet note of it. Subtle reactions were often more revealing than words. As she reviewed her mental notes, a memory surfaced, a case from 20 years past in a neighbouring county, one that had faded from public attention but not from her memory. A dispute between two families, the Ashworths and another local household, had ended in scandal. A young woman poisoned, the matter covered up quickly to avoid public disgrace. The circumstances had been murky, and the perpetrator had never been conclusively identified. The details were faint, but the pattern, the timing, the subtle manipulations, the clever misdirection echoed faintly in her mind of the present. It struck her then, the missing visitor Clara had described could well be connected to that old case, perhaps a surviving member of the family involved, or an associate with old grudges. The thought made her pulse quicken. The present murder was no isolated incident. It had roots buried deep in past grievances, the tendrils of which now reached up to ensnare Catherine. Miss Marple quietly began to draw connections between the suspects. Henry Ashworth's debts were significant, yes, but he had been given little public cause to act violently. Yet, in conjunction with old family rivalries, he might have reason to collude with another. Mrs. Gray's bitterness toward Edward Harrow now seemed layered with something older, a protective impulse, yes, but also a lingering enmity that might explain her knowledge of the hidden visitor and her eagerness to frame Edward. Even Clara's secrecy began to fit a pattern. Perhaps she had witnessed clandestine meetings, unrecognized by anyone else, and her loyalty prevented her from speaking freely. The Queen of Hearts, so far unexplained, began to make more sense in this context. A symbol not merely of romantic treachery, but of vengeance long planned, one that carried messages from one generation to the next. The card was theatrical, yes, but deliberate. Its placement suggested someone familiar with Catherine's habits, someone who knew precisely how it would be found and interpreted. Miss Marple requested that the household remain in the drawing-room, ostensibly for review, while she ventured quietly to the library. There she retrieved a small ledger from the manor's archive, dusty and overlooked. Flipping through the pages, she found references to settlements and disputes dating back decades. One entry in particular caught her eye. Mrs. Gray's family had been wronged in a matter of land and reputation by the Ashworths. Though the dispute had been settled on paper, the bitterness lingered, passing from mother to daughter, as old wounds often do. Miss Marple's mind traced the logical consequences. If Catherine had been positioned as the prize of the Ashworth fortune, she had unknowingly become the symbol upon which a decades-old grudge could strike, an innocent vessel for vengeance long in gestation. Returning to the drawing-room, she spoke quietly, but with gravity. It seems we have overlooked the past, and in doing so we have allowed it to speak through the present. Catherine's death was not merely the product of immediate motives, greed, fear, or jealousy, but of grievances hidden, forgotten by most, remembered by one. She let the silence hang, watching the faces shift. Even the constable frowned, uncertainty threading through his usually rigid certainty. And yet, she continued, the threads are tangled. Each of you here, in some way, interacts with the past, whether knowingly or unknowingly. The key is understanding who has both knowledge of the grievance and the means to act upon it. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward Mrs. Gray. The older woman's composure faltered for a heartbeat, a flicker, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark her as the possessor of some hidden connection. Miss Marple's mind raced. The old visitor, the long-forgotten debt, the careful placement of the Queen of Hearts. All pieces converged toward a single overlooked nexus, a vendetta passed quietly down generations, finding its moment in Catherine's room, in the silence of a stormy night. Miss Marple leaned back, fingers lightly clasped. The manor, with all its grandeur and whispered history, seemed suddenly smaller, contained by the web of human motivations she had traced. The crime was no longer isolated. It was a continuation, a shadow stretching from the past into the present, reaching out to punish, to manipulate, and to conceal. And within that shadow, she knew, was the true hand that had orchestrated the tragedy, a hand still waiting, still hidden, observing, how the pieces fell. The old lady's eyes, sharp beneath the gentle lids, rested on Mrs. Gray with a serenity that was almost alarming in its calm. The moment was delicate, a balance between revelation and confrontation. One false move could drive the guilty party deeper into secrecy, or, worse, into action. Miss Marple's understanding of the past and its persistent echoes had given her a vantage point the constable lacked, and she knew that patience would yet force the criminal into view. In the quiet that followed, the manor seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the shift. The game was no longer simply about immediate jealousy or ambition. It was entwined with history, with old scores, and with the quiet persistence of those who nurse grievances across decades. And Miss Marple, knitting now with deliberate calm, knew she had found the axis upon which the truth would turn. The shadows of the past were long indeed, but they could not endure the patient scrutiny of one who saw clearly through both time and human nature. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly reviewing the facts once again, letting the puzzle settle in her mind. The threads of motive, the shadows of past grievances, and the subtle contradictions in alibis all wove a complex tapestry, yet one small piece remained stubbornly elusive: the person who had translated old resentment into action. It was time, she decided, for a tactic that was more art than logic, one that relied on observation of character rather than the direct confrontation of evidence. She gathered the household in the drawing-room under the pretence of a casual tea. The storm outside had subsided, leaving a damp quiet and a sky pressed grey against the windows. On the small table before her, she arranged the Queen of Hearts, the vial found beneath the cabinet, and a few other seemingly innocuous items from Catherine's room: perfume bottles, a torn scrap of stationery, and a delicate lace handkerchief. To anyone else, it appeared a simple demonstration, a revisitation of the previous night's horrors. To Miss Marple, it was a subtle psychological trap. The guests, still unsettled by the constable's hasty declaration of Edward Harrow's guilt, settled into their chairs, some nervously fidgeting, others with thinly masked relief. Lady Ashworth remained quiet, hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting from Miss Marple to the assembled items. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began softly, "we have had much talk about this unfortunate evening, and yet I am troubled that so many pieces of evidence remain unexamined in the way they should be. Sometimes, in a moment of calm, one can learn more about a person from their reaction to objects than from their words." She gestured toward the table. "Would you each mind telling me, quite simply, how these things make you feel?" There was a pause. The request seemed innocent enough, but Miss Marple knew instinctively that the smallest reaction would speak volumes. Henry Ashworth leaned forward, eyes fixed on the vial. I feel concern," he said quickly, with an effort at composure. "It is unpleasant to consider." Clara, the maid, had her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she trembled slightly as her gaze fell upon the lace handkerchief. "It reminds me of her," she whispered, voice nearly breaking, "of Miss Catherine. That was her favourite." Edward Harrow, sitting upright, eyes steady, said, "It is unfortunate, yes, but hardly surprising. The tragedy was inevitable, in a sense." His measured words seemed too formal, too distant, as though he were reciting a prepared statement. Miss Marple made a mental note. The air of detachment was a shield, not sorrow. Mrs. Gray, however, startled her. As Miss Marple lifted the Queen of Hearts, placing it gently in her palm, Mrs. Gray's fingers twitched, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "A mere trinket, I suppose, of little significance except for sentimentality, I dare say." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. "Is that so?" she asked softly. "And yet, my dear, it is curious that your hand reacted before your words, and so distinctly. A trinket that seems meaningless to one may carry the weight of memory to another. Do you not think?" Mrs. Gray's eyes flickered, a fraction of an instant, to the door. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. It spoke of avoidance, of someone unwilling to dwell on a reminder of the past. That flicker, so small that no one else noticed, was the subtle crack she had been waiting for. To her mind, it connected directly to the visitor Clara had described, the man who had arrived late and met only with Mrs. Gray. That meeting had been deliberate, secretive. The Queen of Hearts was a symbol, and its presence here, the way Mrs. Gray reacted, confirmed that she alone understood its significance beyond mere theatrics. Miss Marple's intuition told her that the card was more than a taunt. It was a signature, and she had just glimpsed the hand that had placed it. She allowed the moment to linger, letting tension fill the room without comment. The others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the subtle shift but uncertain of its meaning. Then she spoke, almost casually. Sometimes people forget that small tokens hold memories, of promises, of slights, of debts unpaid, and sometimes one who fears exposure will react not in words but in gesture. Mrs. Gray's hand clenched faintly, as if resisting some internal command. She spoke with forced steadiness. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I hold no memories that influence the present. We all have our recollections, and we are powerless over them." The old lady's lips twitched in a subtle smile, knitting needles resting on her lap. "Perhaps," she said gently, "but memories sometimes reach across time, and those who walk carefully among them may yet stumble when confronted by their own pasts." The test, simple in execution, had worked precisely as she intended. While everyone else gave rote, rehearsed reactions, Mrs. Gray's body betrayed a secret familiarity, a recognition of something far older than the present night. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the subtle patterns, Mrs. Gray's family history of grievances, her knowledge of the late visitor, her eagerness to frame Edward, and now her involuntary reaction to the Queen of Hearts. Even Henry, though nervous, was transparent. Clara, loyal and terrified, remained a witness rather than a manipulator. Edward's stoicism, Miss Marple noted, stemmed from careful distance rather than guilt. But Mrs. Gray, her eyes, her flicker, the tautness of her hand, revealed a depth of involvement that the others had not betrayed. She knew more than she should, and that knowledge had shaped the events of the night, including the final, fatal moment in Catherine's chamber. Miss Marple's satisfaction was quiet, measured. The trick had not forced a confession, nor produced a sudden outburst, but it had revealed the subtle, human imperfection that lay at the heart of guilt. One could hide words, alibi one's actions, and even manipulate circumstance, but one could not always conceal the unbidden movements of the body, the flicker of recognition, the twitch of a finger, the tightening of a hand. She rose, laying the Queen of Hearts back upon the table. "It is often the smallest, most overlooked clues that tell the greatest truths," she said, her eyes moving deliberately across the assembled faces. "We have glimpsed the shadow behind the veil, and once the shadow is seen, the path to revelation becomes far clearer." The constable, still half bewildered by her method, frowned. "But how can such a small reaction mean anything? We need proof, not intuition." Miss Marple nodded, serene. "Yes, my dear, proof is necessary, but one observes first and interprets later. The proof will follow naturally once one knows where to look." In that moment, the drawing-room seemed charged with tension. Mrs. Gray's composure, so carefully maintained, had shown a crack, small but unmistakable, and Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that it was only a matter of time before that crack widened, enough to reveal the truth, hidden for years, yet now exposed to the light by nothing more than a simple, unconventional test. The morning after Miss Marple's subtle test, the manor seemed to hold its breath. A fragile calm had settled over the household, but beneath it ran a tension sharper than any blade. The guests moved quietly, glancing at one another with suspicion, and even the servants whispered behind closed doors. Miss Marple herself had returned to her knitting, though her mind was active, probing, weaving together the threads she had begun to trace the day before. The constable arrived, brisk and eager, bringing news that had initially seemed promising. "I had a look at the Queen of Hearts again, and also the vial we found. It's been logged for safekeeping, ma'am, ready for analysis," he said, setting the small box on the sideboard. "I think we may soon have the proof we need." Miss Marple inclined her head, smiling faintly. "Yes, proof, my dear, is useful, but one must be prepared for those who would rather bury it than let it speak." She thought of Mrs. Gray, the flicker of recognition she had observed the day prior, and she had a feeling that the older woman, clever and patient, was not yet finished. By late morning, the household was gathered for what was intended as a careful review of the evidence. Miss Marple began to recount the sequence of events in a manner that appeared casual, almost conversational, but which subtly encouraged reactions from her listeners. Clara fidgeted, Henry Ashworth grew pale, and Edward Harrow's eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Gray, however, maintained an air of composure that was beginning to strain under Miss Marple's patient scrutiny. Then, just as Miss Marple reached for the small box containing the Queen of Hearts, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with her thoughts, a loud commotion erupted from the library. James the footman appeared at the drawing-room door, his face pale. "Ma'am, the evidence, it's gone. The box, both the vial and the card." "They're gone!" the room erupted. Lady Ashworth gasped, clutching her shawl, while the constable's face drained of colour. "Impossible!" he exclaimed. "I locked it in my office myself." Miss Marple's gaze remained calm, though her mind raced. The evidence had vanished in the briefest window, and only someone with intimate knowledge of the manner and the routines of those within could have accomplished it. She noted carefully who had been near the library. Mrs. Gray had been sitting closest, ostensibly arranging her shawl, but the corner of the room had been unobserved. Henry Ashworth had lingered near the staircase, Edward had excused himself for a moment to speak with a servant, and Clara had been quietly arranging teacups under Miss Marple's supervision. "Someone has moved to hide the truth," Miss Marple said softly, drawing the room's attention. "And when one seeks to hide evidence, it is often because the evidence speaks too clearly against them." The constable's first instinct was outrage. "We must search the house immediately. Every closet, every drawer, every servant's room. Whoever took it shall not escape." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Search, yes, but with care. Panic alerts the guilty party, and that is the last thing we want. They are watching, and they know we are aware that something is missing. Our approach must be deliberate, quiet, and observant. Haste only aids those who would cover their tracks." She turned her attention to Mrs. Gray, who now sat with hands folded tightly in her lap. Her composure, previously flawless, began to fray under the weight of expectation. Miss Marple's eyes, gentle but piercing, rested on her. "It is curious, is it not," she said softly, "that when the evidence disappears, the person who seems most connected to the past, the visitor, the grudges long held, the symbols, suddenly appears the most concerned, yet with a tension that is unlike the rest?" Mrs. Gray's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm simply shocked, Miss Marple. Surely you do not suspect—" The constable, already rising to act, interjected. "We have reason to act, ma'am. Whoever has taken it must be found immediately." Miss Marple held up her hand, her voice calm but firm. "Patience. The evidence, though vanished, has not escaped observation. I have already taken note of who moved when, who glanced where, and whose hands have twitched in nervous gesture. We must allow the guilty party to act, to respond, so that their own instincts betray them. One cannot hide from oneself, after all." Even as she spoke, she traced the subtle interactions she had witnessed the previous day, and combined them with this new disturbance. Mrs. Gray's careful smile, the flicker of unease in her eyes when the Queen of Hearts was handled, and now the disappearance of the very items that could condemn her, these were patterns, not coincidences. Clara, pale and silent, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, if I may," she whispered, "I saw someone near the library late last night. I didn't speak because I thought it nothing. But it may be relevant. They moved a small box, but it was so quick. I could only glimpse a shadow." Miss Marple's eyes met Mrs. Gray's, and for a heartbeat the older woman's facade faltered. She shifted, fingers tightening against her lap, a microcosm of resistance and anxiety. Miss Marple nodded slightly, allowing no words to pass, yet signalling to herself that the thread she had followed was indeed real and active. The constable, frantic, proposed sealing the house, but Miss Marple demurred. Number the guilty party must feel the pressure of awareness, not the panic of confinement. They are clever, yes, but cleverness is brittle when it confronts patient observation. Let them believe they have escaped scrutiny, and yet know that every gesture, every glance, every hesitation is being noted. The day wore on with a tense, almost spectral air. Servants whispered in corners, the guests avoided each other's eyes, and Lady Ashworth moved like a ghost, caught between relief that Edward had been accused and horror at the notion that evidence could vanish under her own roof. By evening, the constable had retraced all possible paths, examined every door, and inspected the rooms repeatedly. The box remained missing. Yet Miss Marple's observations had narrowed the circle. The subtle signs, micro-expressions, half-concealed glances, and nervous gestures pointed consistently toward one presence in the manor, the older woman, Mrs. Gray. She had both opportunity and knowledge, and she had shown herself susceptible to pressure that forced her hand into revealing her tension, even without words. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, allowed the household to grow restless, their imaginations filling in the silence with speculation, and she, quietly and patiently, waited for the guilty party to make the next move. For in her experience, when one attempts to bury the truth, they almost always dig a deeper trap for themselves, leaving a trace visible only to those who watch with careful eyes. The stage was set, and Miss Marple knew the night ahead would prove pivotal. The vanishing evidence had elevated the stakes, but it had also provided the observation she required. The criminal was still among them, and the threads of deceit could now be followed with even greater precision. Every eye, every twitch, every tremor might betray the hand that had orchestrated Catherine's death, and Miss Marple would not let it slip unseen. The Queen of Hearts, absent from its rightful place, remained a silent spectre in her mind, its symbolism sharpened by the theft. The game was no longer only about motive or opportunity. It was about the patient unravelling of carefully hidden truths, and Miss Marple had begun to see the faint outline of the path toward revelation. The following night, the manor seemed to thrum with unease, the air thick with tension from the vanished evidence. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room, had been observing every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture, aware that the guilty party was close, aware that patience was their only weapon. Yet the night held a sinister promise, one she had not anticipated. It began with a scream, piercing, abrupt, slicing through the stillness of the manor like a knife. Miss Marple's knitting fell to her lap, and she rose at once, moving toward the sound with the measured speed of someone who knows precisely where to go. The household followed in a clamour, Lady Ashworth sobbing, Henry Ashworth running toward the corridor, Clara pale and whispering incoherently. The scream had come from the west wing, from the small guest chamber where Edward Harrow had been confined overnight under the constable's watchful eye. When they arrived, the door was ajar, the room empty. Harrow was gone. A cold chill ran through the assembly. The constable's face paled as he realized that the very man they had believed guilty had vanished without a trace. The window was closed, the shutters intact, and no sign of forced entry or escape appeared. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room with calm intensity. There were traces, a faint scuff on the carpet near the door, a slight smudge on the windowsill, a subtle scent of perfume lingering in the air, sharp and bitter. The thief had been careful, but not meticulous. These were signs she had trained herself to notice, and already they told her something the others had not yet grasped. The culprit was bold, patient, and willing to manipulate the scene to their own ends. Before anyone could speak, another movement caught her attention. The sideboard in the corner, usually undisturbed, had been slightly shifted. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper, hastily torn from a notebook, bearing a single jagged word, "Stop." The handwriting was familiar to her, Mrs. Gray's elegant but slightly angular script. The implication was unmistakable. Someone within the manor wished to send a warning, not to conceal a past crime, but to intimidate, to manipulate. The constable demanded answers, his voice rising. Who is responsible for this? Someone has taken Mr. Harrow and they've left a message. We must act. Miss Marple raised her hand, and the room fell silent. Her gaze, serene yet unyielding, swept across the faces gathered. This is no ordinary disappearance, and this warning, she said slowly, is not for us. It is for someone inside this house, someone the writer believes might interfere with their plans. The stakes have risen, my dear friends. We are no longer dealing with a past grievance expressed in secrecy. We are witnessing an active hand, a mind several steps ahead, willing to move dangerously to preserve its ends. Henry Ashworth stammered, But who could have done this? How did they get him out without anyone noticing? Miss Marple folded her hands, calm but penetrating. Careful observation, familiarity with the routines of the house, and above all, patience. The person responsible knows the manner as well as we do, and perhaps better. They have been moving in the shadows for some time. The theft of evidence yesterday, the subtle reactions observed earlier, all pieces of a carefully orchestrated plan. Clara shivered. Ma'am, I think I saw someone near the west wing just before the scream. A shadow. It moved too fast for me to tell who, but it was not Edward. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The signs aligned, the theft of the evidence, the psychological manipulations, the shadowy visitor. Each indicated a cunning mind working deliberately, masking movements and intentions. The person had been testing the household, probing reactions, and now, emboldened, had escalated the danger. Lady Ashworth's hands trembled. Do you think he's dead? Her voice broke, and even Miss Marple felt the weight of the moment. I cannot say for certain, she replied, her tone measured. But what is clear is that we must act swiftly. Whoever orchestrated this intends to continue, and if we do not anticipate their next move, more than one life could be lost. The constable insisted on immediate searches, but Miss Marple intervened. Rushing blindly into the corridors will only benefit the person we seek. Instead, we observe, we note reactions, we understand the pattern of their mind. The next move will be deliberate. We must be ready to anticipate it. Then, as if to prove her point, a sudden crash resounded from the gallery above. Paintings had been knocked askew, a chair toppled, and dust motes floated in the disturbed air. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath the calm veneer, caught a subtle sign. Faint footprints, half-formed in the soft carpet, leading toward the servants' staircase. They were small, careful, yet hurried, another signature of someone attempting to leave without drawing attention. It was clear now, the culprit was not only still among them, but had the audacity to escalate. This was no longer a murder born of past resentment or subtle deception. It was active, dangerous, and increasingly violent. Miss Marple realized the true urgency. The game had changed. She must now protect the innocent, anticipate the criminal's moves, and expose them before another tragedy struck. Her mind traced all prior observations, Mrs. Gray's reactions to the Queen of Hearts, the cryptic warning left for someone inside, the vanishing evidence, and the subtle movements of shadows. Each element pointed consistently in one direction. Yet the manner of Edward Harrow's disappearance indicated daring, confidence, and an intimate knowledge of the manor's secret passages, a trait only someone long accustomed to manoeuvring within these walls could possess. Miss Marple rose, knitting needles tucked aside, and addressed the household with quiet authority. Listen well. The person who has taken Edward, who removed evidence, and who moves unseen is not acting impulsively. They are deliberate, patient, and clever. We must treat every movement, every sound, every glance as significant. Do not speak unless necessary. Observe, remain calm, and trust nothing is as it seems. The next moments will determine the course of events here. The constable, tension taut in his posture, nodded, and the household obeyed with a reluctant stillness. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the shadows along the corridor, noting where the light failed and where the next movement might emerge. She understood now that the villain's advantage was speed and misdirection, but she also knew that patience, clarity, and observation could unmask even the most cunning adversary. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows with a low, haunting whistle, echoing the dread that had settled inside. The manor's halls, once merely the scene of an old grievance, had become a labyrinth in which lives hung precariously, and the villain's next act could occur at any moment. Miss Marple, standing quietly yet fully alert, allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. The unexpected twist had arrived, yes, but it had also clarified the path. The hand behind the crimes had revealed its boldness, and in doing so, had given her the key to anticipating their next move. The game had escalated, the stakes were higher, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would ensure that the truth, though pursued through danger, would not escape her. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, the storm outside now replaced by a damp, heavy silence that pressed against the windows. The events of the past 24 hours had left the household tense, nerves frayed by Edward Harrow's disappearance and the stolen evidence. Yet the old lady's mind was calm, moving steadily through each observation she had made. The trick, she knew, was to look not at what was obvious, but at what others dismissed as inconsequential. The pattern, she realized, had been whispering all along. The first thread that called to her was the Queen of Hearts, so theatrically placed on the table, yet so deliberately ignored by most. Mrs. Gray's reaction to it had been subtle but telling, a twitch of the fingers, a glance toward the door, a fleeting tightening of the jaw. Then there was the cryptic warning left in Edward's empty chamber, a single word scrawled in familiar handwriting. It was not merely a threat, it was a signal, a psychological play designed to intimidate and mislead, aimed at the one who would probe too deeply. Miss Marple's eyes roved over the room, taking in the small details that had previously seemed irrelevant. A chair slightly ajar, a teacup set back on the table in haste, the faint perfume that lingered in the air, traces of hurried movement, signs of stress and calculation. Each object, each reaction was a piece of a larger puzzle. The key, she began to see, was not in the grand gestures or in the most dramatic clues, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible habits of those involved. She recalled Clara, the maid, who had fumbled a silver spoon the evening of the first murder. It had seemed trivial at the time, an ordinary nervousness. But combined with her later admission of seeing a shadow moving near the west wing, it formed part of a narrative, a series of movements and observations that had gone unnoticed by others, yet pointed toward a single locus of activity. Miss Marple's gaze rested on Mrs. Gray again. The older woman had a habit of tilting her head slightly when nervous, a subtle motion she had repeated several times over the course of the interviews and the psychological test with the Queen of Hearts. Alone, it might have been dismissed. Combined with the vanished evidence and the cryptic warning, it became significant. The tilt, almost imperceptible, occurred whenever Mrs. Gray attempted to reconcile what she had done with the scrutiny she faced. It was a habit that betrayed consciousness of her own guilt. Another detail emerged, the small scuff near the west wing window. At first it had seemed like a mere accident, perhaps the result of a chair or a hurried footstep. Yet when Miss Marple retraced the path of the shadow Clara had seen, she realized it was no accident. The scuff marked the exact spot where the criminal had shifted the weight of their body, moving carefully but with haste to conceal an escape route. It was a motion repeated in other subtle traces throughout the manor. Slight disruptions in the arrangement of objects, faint impressions in the carpet, and the careful, almost imperceptible repositioning of furniture to hide access. The pattern continued to emerge as Miss Marple considered the reactions of each individual. Henry Ashworth's nervous glance toward the window when the warning was discovered, Edward Harrow's measured distance during the initial tests, and Lady Ashworth's nearly imperceptible flinch at mention of the Queen of Hearts. Each behaviour had been catalogued, yet only one person consistently demonstrated both knowledge and subtle manipulation. Mrs. Gray. The interactions, the stolen evidence, the psychological pressures applied through objects, all pointed inexorably to her. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the timeline, connecting past grievances to present actions. Mrs. Gray had been intimately aware of old disputes between her family and the Ashworths, and she had cultivated an opportunity to exact revenge while appearing innocent. Her subtle movements and careful orchestration of events allowed her to manipulate the household without drawing suspicion. The vanished evidence had been a deliberate test, gauging how far others would pursue the truth. Edward Harrow's disappearance was yet another layer, a calculated escalation to intimidate and mislead. Then she recalled a detail that had seemed trivial at first. Mrs. Gray's casual comment about the house's layout, made during a previous conversation. "These corridors are confusing for those who are unfamiliar," she had said lightly. At the time, it had seemed merely polite conversation. Now, Miss Marple realized, it was an oblique reference to her intimate knowledge of the manor, its secret passages and hidden alcoves. She alone could move undetected, place objects with precision, and orchestrate events so that the rest of the household remained oblivious. The pieces snapped into place. the Queen of Hearts, the vial, the cryptic warning, Edward's disappearance, and the subtle manipulations of the environment all formed a coherent pattern. It was not a chaotic or haphazard series of crimes. It was a meticulously planned sequence, executed with patience, cunning, and a deep understanding of human behaviour. And at the centre of it all, Miss Marple now saw clearly, was the woman who had always seemed most innocuous, Mrs. Gray. Miss Marple rose, knitting needles tucked into her pocket, and addressed the room. The truth has been here all along, hidden in plain sight. What seemed like trivialities, small gestures, minor movements, casual comments, were in fact signals, markers, and manipulations. The pattern was there for those who observed closely, and now, understanding it, we can anticipate the next move of the person who has orchestrated this tragedy. The constable, though still somewhat bewildered by her method, nodded. "So, we know who it is?" Miss Marple's eyes, serene yet piercing, rested on Mrs. Gray. "We know who has acted, and we know how they think. The pattern reveals not just the past and present, but the pathway forward. And if we are careful, deliberate, and patient, we can ensure that no further harm comes before justice is served." Every small detail, the tilt of a head, the faint scuff marks, the stolen evidence, the cryptic warning, the offhand comment, had converged into clarity. What had once been a baffling tangle of motives, shadows, and misdirection now appeared as a single, comprehensible plan. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and keen eye, had finally begun to see the full shape of the criminal's design. The house, heavy with suspense, seemed to wait along with her. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, rustling leaves against the windows like whispered secrets. Inside, Miss Marple's calm presence radiated certainty. The unexpected twists and vanished evidence had not thrown her off. They had illuminated the very method of the perpetrator, and in the pattern that emerged, she now held the key to ending the chain of deception before another tragedy struck. Miss Marple spent the remainder of that restless night reflecting quietly by the fire, the soft tick of the grandfather clock echoing the slow, deliberate rhythm of her thoughts. She had traced the pattern, observed the subtle betrayals in body language, and followed the trail of vanished evidence and minor disturbances. Yet she knew that the pattern alone did not fully explain the force behind the actions. The true motive still lay obscured, wrapped in the psychology of the criminal. What drove someone to manipulate, intimidate, and ultimately take life? Morning arrived with a grey, hesitant light spilling into the manor, casting long shadows along the corridors. Miss Marple moved with deliberate calm, gathering the household under the guise of a discussion of recent events. The tension was tangible. Every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every half-word spoken felt weighted with fear and anticipation. Yet her own serenity was a contrast, a quiet signal that the day would reveal much if observed carefully. She began to speak in her gentle, measured voice, recalling the events as if narrating an almost academic case study rather than accusing a fellow guest. "Yesterday, we uncovered evidence of a disappearance and a theft," she said, "and yet those acts, while alarming, were not the ultimate expression of intent. Actions, like words, carry a deeper weight when connected to past experience. What drives a person to plan, to manipulate, and to escalate beyond mere opportunity?" Her gaze drifted slowly to Mrs. Gray, who sat upright, hands folded, eyes carefully neutral. Yet beneath that practiced composure, Miss Marple noted the same small micro-expressions that had betrayed her before. The faint tilt of the head, the subtle tightening of the lips, a blink just a fraction too long. These were signs of inner turmoil, suppressed emotion, and, most crucially, a hidden need so powerful it justified extremes in the mind of the guilty. Miss Marple continued, "It is often said that crimes are committed for money, power, or revenge. And yes, all of these may play a role, but they alone rarely drive one to the precise, patient orchestration we have observed here. There is a motive far deeper, rooted not in greed alone, but in a desire to settle an unacknowledged debt, to assert control over a past wrong, to rewrite the balance of moral justice as the criminal perceives it." A small gasp from Lady Ashworth punctuated the room. But Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from Mrs. Grey, who adjusted her posture ever so slightly, betraying a ripple of tension. The old lady's heart and mind, she realized, had been ensnared not simply by opportunity but by a lingering sense of injustice, coupled with personal fixation. "The clues all point to one person," Miss Marple said quietly. "The meticulous movements, the vanished evidence, the psychological manipulations, the cryptic warning, these were not random. Each act was intended to provoke a reaction, to shape the perceptions of those involved, and to achieve a satisfaction not available in ordinary life." Mrs. Grey's composure finally wavered. Her hands clutched the edge of her chair as if to anchor herself. I do not understand," she stammered, voice trembling. Why do you say it is me? It was only—" Her words faltered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes calm, patient, yet unwavering. "It was only, Mrs. Grey, a means of restoring a balance you perceived, a justice that was denied in your view. You were willing to manipulate, intimidate, and even end a life in order to achieve it. But there is more than revenge here, more than a mere desire to see wrongs righted. You were shaping reality itself, attempting to control the outcome of events as though life were a game, and each person a piece moved according to your will." The confession, though unspoken, trembled at the edge of Mrs. Grey's lips. Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "I observed your reactions, the subtle gestures when faced with the Queen of Hearts, the flicker of recognition when objects recalled past grievances, the micro-expressions when evidence vanished. All of it points to someone who could not simply act in the moment. They had to orchestrate the moment, control every variable, and test the patience and perception of all around them." Mrs. Grey's voice rose, a mixture of indignation and suppressed despair. "You don't understand. You don't know what it felt like. To be invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Edward, he represented everything I could never claim. Catherine, her life, the Ashworth's complacency. I had to act, to prove that I could manipulate the outcome, that I mattered." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her gaze never left the other woman. "And so you did. But in your desire to impose order upon your past grievances, you caused suffering, terror, and ultimately death. The depth of your motive, long-standing resentment, obsession with perceived slights, and the need for recognition made you capable of extreme measures. It was not merely money or power that drove you, but the psychological imperative to assert control, to craft a world in which your grievances were validated and your intellect demonstrated." Mrs. Grey's composure shattered. Tears welled, her body trembling. I didn't mean. I only wanted to be seen, to matter." Miss Marple nodded gently, allowing the confession to emerge through the fissure in the carefully constructed facade. The crime, she realized, was not simple revenge or greed. It was an intricate expression of human psychology, a dangerous need to rewrite perceived injustices and impose personal order on a world that had, in her mind, wronged her. The household remained silent, the weight of the revelation pressing on them all. Lady Ashworth covered her face with her hands. Henry Ashworth looked stunned, and even the constable seemed momentarily speechless. Miss Marple, ever calm, continued, "Understanding the motive is essential, for it explains not only what was done, but why it was done, why the steps taken were so deliberate, so patient, and so seemingly untraceable. The actions of the criminal can only be fully comprehended when one sees the deep personal necessity that drove them, what they believed they must do to reconcile the past, and how they measured each act in terms of control, satisfaction, and retribution." Mrs. Grey's confession spilled further, each word a window into the intricate workings of a mind shaped by years of perceived neglect and resentment. Her meticulous planning, the vanished evidence, the calculated disappearance of Edward Harrow, all were consistent with a personality driven by obsession, need for validation, and the overwhelming desire to assert influence over the lives of others. It was, Miss Marple realized, a tragedy of human psychology, as much as it was a criminal act. By the afternoon, with Mrs. Grey's full motive revealed, Miss Marple felt the threads of the case aligning into coherence. The complexity of her actions, the manipulations, the psychological tests, all made sense in light of the deep-seated need that had driven her. The crime was not merely opportunistic, it was the enactment of an internal compulsion, carefully calculated to achieve recognition and satisfaction, no matter the human cost. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, looked around the room. Justice in this case would require acknowledgement not only of the acts themselves, but of the intricate psychology that had produced them, and in that acknowledgement lay the key to ensuring no further harm would come. The hidden motive at last lay bare, a convoluted, obsessive desire to assert control over perceived wrongs, to manipulate and test the patience of others, and to validate a sense of importance that had long been denied. It was a revelation as shocking as it was tragic, illuminating the darkness of human obsession that had transformed grievances into murder, manipulation, and terror. Miss Marple had spent the night considering every nuance, every subtle sign, and every motion that had seemed inconsequential to others. The pattern was clear now, and the hidden motive revealed. It was time to act. She did not rush. She moved with deliberate care, arranging the household in a manner that would bring the guilty party into the open without alerting them to her plan. By late morning, the residents of Ashworth Manor gathered in the drawing-room under the pretence of reviewing the day's events, though Miss Marple knew the true purpose was far more precise. Chairs were arranged just so, windows slightly ajar to create subtle shadows and movement. The household servants, carefully briefed, maintained calm vigilance, aware that any sudden act could set the trap in motion. Miss Marple herself took a seat near the centre of the room, knitting, resting in her lap, but eyes scanning, measuring and recording each movement. She spoke softly, almost conversationally, about the vanished evidence and Edward Harrow's disappearance, drawing reactions in subtle increments. Each word was chosen to elicit a micro-expression, a gesture, or a slip that might betray the guilty party. Henry Ashworth shifted nervously on his chair, Lady Ashworth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Clara, the maid, arranged the tea set with trembling hands. But it was Mrs. Gray who drew Miss Marple's full attention. The older woman sat upright, her composure still intact but more brittle than ever. A small tremor in her fingers, the slight twitch of a mouth corner, and the careful avoidance of direct eye contact were all signals that the trap was taking hold. Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet deliberate, drifted through the room. We have seen how evidence can vanish and how shadows can move unseen, but one cannot hide from observation indefinitely. Even the most careful orchestration reveals itself, in gesture, in movement, and in thought. It is time to consider what has motivated these actions, and how the perpetrator, though clever, is ultimately constrained by their own nature. Mrs. Gray's eyes flickered nervously, and for a moment the room seemed suspended in a taut silence, each heartbeat amplified by anticipation. Miss Marple continued, describing with precise subtlety the pattern she had observed, the vanished vial, the cryptic warning, Edward's disappearance, and the small, seemingly insignificant details that had revealed the larger plan. She spoke as if discussing these events academically, but every word was aimed to corner the mind that had orchestrated them. The older woman's hands twisted together tightly, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the scrutiny. Miss Marple waited, patient and unflinching, letting silence build like a tide ready to pull everything into its pull. Then ever so slightly, Mrs. Gray rose, as if compelled to action, her movements betraying a nervous resolve. I suppose you have noticed," she stammered, her voice low but trembling. "Perhaps I cannot deny it any longer. Yes, I acted. But you do not understand." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, softly but sharply like a conductor's baton. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Gray," she said calmly. "I understand the motive, the method, and the manipulation. Every action you took, every object you moved, every word you whispered in fear or in hope of misdirection, it all forms a pattern that has led us here. You can no longer hide behind subtlety or patience." Mrs. Gray's breath quickened, her face pale. I only wanted to correct what was wrong, to be seen, to matter." Miss Marple's eyes softened, acknowledging the raw humanity in the confession, yet remained unyielding in their precision. And so you acted, believing yourself to be both judge and arbiter. But that path, as you now see, leads to consequences beyond your control. The lives touched, the fear inspired, the death of Catherine, these cannot be undone by cleverness or patience. What you sought through manipulation must, now, be met with accountability. Mrs. Gray's hands shook visibly. She looked around the room as if searching for escape, but every route had been anticipated. Miss Marple had positioned herself to observe the exit subtly, ensuring that no sudden flight could succeed. "There is nowhere to go, Mrs. Gray," she said gently. "No shadows left in which to hide, no evidence left undiscovered, no trick unobserved. It is time to speak fully, to admit everything, and to allow justice to follow its due course." The older woman sank into her chair, head bowed. I never wished for anyone to die. I only wanted to show that I could—" Her voice broke, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was clever, yes, but I did not intend for the pain to spread so far, for the world to feel the weight of my actions." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging both the guilt and the profound miscalculation. "Your actions were driven by a motive far deeper than mere revenge or greed. They were a pursuit of recognition, a desperate attempt to assert control over a world that had overlooked you, and that understanding is essential, not to excuse your actions, but to understand the breadth of their impact." The constable stepped forward cautiously, gently taking Mrs. Gray's hands in his and noting her complete surrender. "You will come with me now," he said quietly, and Mrs. Gray nodded, finally accepting the inevitability of her capture. Miss Marple remained seated, knitting once more, the sharp tension in the room slowly diffusing. The household exhaled collectively, relief mingling with lingering shock. The final confrontation had revealed the truth fully, and the chain of deception had been broken. The carefully orchestrated manipulations, the vanished evidence, Edward Harrow's disappearance, and the cryptic warnings, all had been brought into clarity by patient observation and subtle pressure. Lady Ashworth approached Miss Marple, her voice trembling. "I cannot thank you enough. Without your insight, we might never have understood." Miss Marple inclined her head, eyes serene. "Observation, patience, and understanding the motives beneath action. These are often more telling than any obvious clue. What appeared complex and unsolvable was, in truth, a pattern hidden in plain sight. Now that the pattern is revealed, the danger is ended, and those who suffered may begin to recover." Outside, the sky brightened with late afternoon light, casting long, soft shadows through the windows. Inside Ashworth Manor, calm replaced fear, though the memory of terror lingered. Miss Marple, ever composed, recognized that justice had been restored, not only through exposure of the crime, but through comprehension of the motive that had driven it to its extreme. The final confrontation had been won not by force or accusation, but by observation, patience, and the quiet insistence that truth, no matter how cleverly concealed, will reveal itself in time. Mrs. Gray, escorted gently by the constable, cast one final glance at Miss Marple, a mixture of fear, awe, and understanding. Miss Marple simply nodded, acknowledging both the tragedy and the inevitability of consequence. In that glance, the detective saw the full weight of motive and method, and knew that the intricate, dangerous game had finally reached its conclusion. The manor seemed to breathe a tentative sigh of relief. Mrs. Gray was in custody, the household gradually returning to a semblance of normality, and the constable had begun cataloguing the evidence recovered during the final confrontation. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room, felt a subtle tension she could not ignore. Something remained unsettled, a whisper of inconsistency buried beneath the apparent resolution. As she traced the events in her mind, she returned again and again to Edward Harrow's disappearance. The man had vanished under circumstances so precise that only someone intimately familiar with the manner could have executed it. Mrs. Gray's confession accounted for the psychological manipulations, the cryptic warnings, and the vanished evidence, but the timing of Edward's disappearance and the manner in which he had been moved suggested a second hand at play, a shadow beyond the one already exposed. Miss Marple rose and moved quietly through the corridors, retracing steps from the previous day. The West Wing hallway still bore subtle signs of hurried movement. faint impressions in the carpet, the slight misalignment of baseboards, a door left ajar for just the smallest fraction of time. Something about the arrangement, the subtle cues of directionality, suggested that someone had worked alongside Mrs. Gray, or perhaps even manipulated her, knowingly or unknowingly, to serve a larger design. Returning to the drawing room, she observed the household with careful attention. Each face, each gesture seemed ordinary, but observation demanded patience. A hand that lingered too long on a teacup, a glance toward the window, the minute shift of a foot beneath a chair. These were whispers of intent, the residue of actions that had not yet been fully accounted for. It was Lady Ashworth herself who drew Miss Marple's attention. Throughout the confessions and the final confrontation, she had remained visibly anxious, a subtle tremor beneath her composed exterior. Her fingers fidgeted occasionally, a careful repetition of a gesture that had otherwise seemed inconsequential. And there was something in the timing of her reactions, moments when Mrs. Gray's explanations elicited either too much or too little response, as though Lady Ashworth were measuring, calculating, silently confirming details she alone could verify. Miss Marple allowed a moment of calm, letting the household chatter settle around her, then began questioning gently, almost conversationally. "Lady Ashworth, Edward's disappearance was so perfectly executed, yet there were moments when you seemed unusually attentive, almost anticipating his movements. Were you perhaps aware of more than you initially disclosed?" The lady froze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A faint flush rose to her cheeks. I don't know what you mean," she said, voice quiet, measured. But the slight quiver betrayed her. Miss Marple smiled ever so subtly, her eyes serene yet penetrating. "It is not uncommon for a person to be caught in the net of circumstance, even inadvertently. But I have learned to notice those moments when one is not merely reacting, but subtly guiding, shaping events while appearing passive. Such things often leave traces, though they may be smaller than any ordinary observer could detect." Lady Ashworth's composure cracked. Her voice, almost inaudible at first, gained strength as guilt wrestled with denial. I did not mean for anyone to get hurt. Edward was meddling. He had seen too much of the household affairs, matters that should have remained private. I thought, if he were removed for a short time, nothing would be harmed. I never intended him to vanish for so long, or for the chaos to spread. Miss Marple listened, her calm presence never faltering. The puzzle pieces now fell into a second, more subtle pattern. Lady Ashworth had not acted out of malice in the same sense as Mrs. Gray. Her motivations were protective, guided by a desire to shield the household, to manage appearances, and to prevent exposure of personal secrets. Yet her intervention had been crucial, orchestrating movements and timings that, until this revelation, had seemed inexplicable. "The disappearance," Miss Marple said quietly, "was a collaboration in effect, though perhaps not a deliberate partnership. Mrs. Gray's manipulations and your adjustments created the conditions for Edward's absence to appear both precise and untraceable. And in doing so, it magnified the impact of her psychological games, even as you sought to protect your household. The result, however unintended, has been extraordinary." The household fell silent. Even the constable who had handled evidence, interrogated suspects and witnessed confessions, felt a momentary uncertainty creep into his mind. The neat resolution of Mrs. Gray's confession was now complicated by a second actor, someone whose subtle interventions had shifted the course of events in ways few could have predicted. Lady Ashworth's hands trembled, and she lowered her gaze. "I only wanted to protect, to ensure nothing worse happened. I did not expect." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice gentle but firm. "Intentions, while important, do not erase consequence. Yet understanding your role allows us to comprehend fully how this chain of events unfolded. The true genius of the criminal mind is not always in one person alone. Sometimes it is the interaction, the unintended collaboration that produces outcomes far beyond anyone's expectation. You acted with care, but your actions, when combined with Mrs. Gray's determination, allowed the sequence to progress to its maximum complexity. A wave of realization passed through the room. The house had been both stage and instrument, and while Mrs. Gray had carried the central burden of action, Lady Ashworth's subtle interventions had accelerated and shaped the outcomes. The case, Miss Marple understood, had tested her keenest faculties yet. The initial pattern, the hidden motive, and the final confrontation had exposed one layer, but the last-minute twist revealed the true depth of interplay between human intention and consequence. Miss Marple rose slowly, walking to the window and gazing at the now clear sky. "The final truth," she said softly, "is rarely as simple as it seems. One act, one motive, one confession, these rarely capture the totality of human action. The pattern is more intricate, and the consequences of even small choices may be magnified in ways we cannot immediately perceive. This case, while resolved in the eyes of law, has revealed both deliberate malice and unintended influence, and both must be understood to grasp the full story." Lady Ashworth's shoulders slumped, a mixture of relief and remorse in her posture. "I see now. The world does not bend to our understanding, does it? Even the smallest gestures can have consequences far beyond our control." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, yet in understanding these consequences, we can also learn to observe, to anticipate, and perhaps prevent similar tragedies in the future. The brilliance of a mind attuned to human nature lies not only in solving puzzles, but in comprehending the forces that shape them. And that is why we are here, together, at the end of this remarkable, twisted, and ultimately revealing series of events." The household, absorbing the full import of the last-minute revelation, exhaled collectively. The labyrinth of manipulation, motive, and subtle interference had been laid bare. The genius of the case was not only in uncovering the overt criminal, but in revealing the hidden interplay that had produced consequences beyond expectation. And in that moment, Miss Marple's patience, observation, and deep understanding of human nature had proven once more to be unassailable. The manner, quiet and settled at last, seemed to reflect the resolution. Not perfect, not without lingering shadows, but complete enough for justice, understanding, and reflection to take hold. The final twist had tested her mind, her patience, and her skill, yet she had emerged with clarity, insight, and the unerring knowledge that even the most intricate human designs could eventually be read by those who know how to look closely enough. The manor was quiet now, yet the air still held a tension that no ordinary calm could dispel. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, while inside the household gathered with a fragile mixture of relief and lingering unease. Mrs. Gray had been taken into custody, her confession laid bare, and Lady Ashworth had admitted to her subtle, unintended manipulations that had aided in Edward Harrow's temporary disappearance. Yet, as Miss Marple surveyed the room, she knew that the threads of truth were not yet fully accounted for. There remained a subtle, unspoken question. Had justice truly been served? The constable, though diligent, seemed somewhat perplexed by the layers that had emerged. "Miss Marple," he said, "we have Mrs. Gray. She confessed, and Lady Ashworth's role was minor, incidental. Isn't that enough?" Miss Marple shook her head gently, her gaze moving slowly across the room. "What seems enough is rarely sufficient when human nature complicates what might otherwise be simple. Justice, like observation, must consider both overt acts and the subtle patterns that shape them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We must ask ourselves, were all forces at work fully revealed, or have we only seen the surface?" The household exchanged nervous glances. The tension was palpable, as though even the walls of Ashworth Manor were aware that the story was not yet complete. Miss Marple's eyes rested again on Lady Ashworth. The lady's composure had returned outwardly, but her posture betrayed lingering anxiety, a residue of decisions made in haste, and of interventions that had, intentionally or not, shaped the events so profoundly. Miss Marple began to trace the subtle, often overlooked clues that had guided her thinking. "Consider the Queen of Hearts," she said softly. At first glance it seemed a curious, almost whimsical insertion into the series of events. Yet it was a deliberate psychological test, designed to provoke recognition and reaction. Few observed the precise way Mrs. Gray responded, tension in the fingers, a slight head tilt, and fewer still recognized it as a deliberate signal, a marker of guilt. She turned her attention to the vanished vial, the cryptic warning, and Edward Harrow's disappearance. Each element, she explained patiently, had been part of a layered strategy, seemingly chaotic to outsiders but coherent when traced through the lens of motive, opportunity, and psychological manipulation. Even Lady Ashworth's subtle interventions, the minute shifts in positioning, the small anticipations of movement, had contributed to the illusion of perfection in Mrs. Gray's plan. The constable nodded slowly, beginning to see the depth of observation required to uncover the full pattern. "I see now. It wasn't just about catching Mrs. Gray. Every minor action, every reaction, every small detail mattered. Miss Marple, you saw what we could not." "Yes," she said, her knitting resuming quietly in her lap, the rhythmic clicking echoing her calm deliberation. "Observation requires attention to those small details that are invisible until recognized, unnoticed until they form a coherent pattern. Justice is not served merely by apprehending a perpetrator. It is served when the web of action, reaction, and consequence is fully understood. Only then can one grasp both culpability and the broader truth of human behavior." A small stir moved through the room as Edward Harrow, recovered but shaken, was escorted back. He had been unharmed, yet the ordeal left him visibly altered. Miss Marple observed the man's subtle cues, unease, lingering suspicion, and the cautious relief that no immediate danger remained. She recognized that the case, though legally concluded with Mrs. Gray's arrest, would leave psychological traces for many within the household. Justice, she reflected, was not only a matter of law, but of awareness, understanding, and the restoration of order where possible. Yet, as she contemplated the events, a final lingering doubt remained, a trace of action, subtle and almost imperceptible, that had not yet been fully explained. She allowed a pause, letting the room settle into quiet observation. "There is always one last detail that escapes immediate notice," she said softly. "It is the residue of human choice, the element that no plan, however meticulous, can entirely eliminate. In this case, it is the small gestures and decisions that shape outcomes even after the central crime is revealed. And it is in observing these that one may find the final measure of justice, or the absence of it." Lady Ashworth shifted, hands clasped tightly. "Do you mean someone could still be at large?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Miss Marple shook her head lightly, smiling faintly. "Not necessarily at large, my dear. But even when culpability is accounted for, the consequences of our actions ripple outward. One may face the law and yet remain haunted by decisions, regrets, and the indirect influence of those actions on others. Justice, therefore, is not a singular event, but a process, ongoing and layered, measured in observation and understanding, as much as in punishment." The constable, looking both relieved and contemplative, acknowledged the subtlety. "I think I understand, Miss Marple. We may have apprehended the criminal, but the full scope, the psychological and circumstantial depth, requires careful reflection." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, her demeanour as serene as ever. "Indeed, and it is precisely why observation, patience, and comprehension are indispensable. The clues most easily overlooked, the tilt of a head, a subtle movement of the hand, a carefully chosen word, these are often the ones that reveal the truth when all else seems resolved. They ensure that justice, when delivered, is not only procedural, but insightful, measured, and aware." She allowed a moment of silence, the household absorbing her words. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, she concluded, "In this manner, justice has been served to the extent possible. Mrs. Gray will face the consequences of her actions, yet the subtle threads of influence, the psychological manipulations, and the unintended consequences of others' interventions remind us that human behavior is never simple, and justice is never absolute. What appears complete may conceal layers yet to be fully understood. That is why observation, understanding, and reflection are essential companions to law and consequence, Edward Harrow, now seated and regaining composure, cast a thoughtful glance toward Miss Marple. "So, the real story was in the details we could not see at first," he said, voice low. "The small things mattered more than the obvious evidence." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. And it is in those small, overlooked elements that one sees the full character of human action, the hidden motivations, and the subtleties that can make the difference between resolution and continued uncertainty. Justice has been delivered, but it is tempered by the understanding that human nature is complex, and that even when one step ahead, one must remain attentive to what remains unseen." The household exhaled collectively, tension slowly giving way to a quiet reflection. The crimes had been revealed, the motives exposed, and the manipulations understood. Yet, in Miss Marple's words, lingered the gentle, unsettling reminder that human choices are rarely simple, and that consequences, like shadows, often extend beyond immediate comprehension. Justice, it seemed, had been served, but with the full awareness that the story's reach stretched into subtler, more enduring truths. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, serene once more. The manner was calm, yet the echo of observation and insight remained. Every overlooked clue had been accounted for, every hidden motive exposed, and every subtle action understood. And in that careful, comprehensive reckoning, she demonstrated once again why a keen eye, patience, and understanding of human nature could remain unmatched, even in the face of deception that seemed complete. The manor, bathed in the soft glow of evening, had finally settled into a quiet rhythm. Servants moved with muted efficiency, arranging tables and extinguishing lamps, while Lady Ashworth and her son lingered near the drawing-room window, exchanging words in hushed tones. Edward Harrow, though recovered, remained seated in contemplative silence, as though replaying every moment of his disappearance and the chaos that had ensued. Even the constable, who had once seemed steadfast and unflappable, now walked with a measured caution, the weight of human complexity pressing upon him more keenly than any case he had previously encountered. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her corner, observed all with a gentle detachment, her eyes flicking with an awareness that was almost invisible yet impossible to escape. She had resolved the central mystery. Mrs. Gray's confession had been extracted, Lady Ashworth's subtle interventions exposed, and Edward safely returned. The pattern, the motives, and the psychological threads had all been revealed, each piece carefully accounted for. And yet, as she reflected on the hours of observation, she felt a familiar tug, the sensation that something, however small, remained unresolved. It was in the margins of memory, in the peripheral details she had catalogued yet not yet fully interrogated. A folded note, slightly crumpled, had been found near the west wing hallway. Initially dismissed as inconsequential, it bore a cryptic series of symbols, almost like a code, alongside a barely legible phrase, "The game is never truly finished." Miss Marple had noticed it, but she had chosen not to reveal it immediately, believing the confession and exposures sufficient for the household's comprehension. Yet now, as the evening shadows deepened, the note whispered a subtle warning. There were always layers beyond the ones laid bare. She rose and walked slowly through the corridors of Ashworth Manor, letting her fingers brush along the polished balustrades, listening to the faint creak of floorboards beneath her steps. The manor, though quiet, seemed almost alive with residual tension, the echo of hurried movements, the tremors of guilt, the lingering fear of discovery. Each room held evidence of both the confessed acts and the subtle, unseen interventions. Even in absence, human intention left traces that could be read if one knew how to observe. Miss Marple paused at the west wing hallway, the place where Edward's disappearance had been orchestrated. She crouched slightly to examine the faint impressions in the carpet once more, her eyes tracing the subtle indentations of hurried steps, now faded, but still present. Something about the alignment struck her as odd, an irregularity in the final approach to the door, almost imperceptible. At the time it had seemed part of Lady Ashworth's inadvertent contribution, but now she reconsidered. The alignment suggested deliberation, an unseen hand ensuring that certain movements would remain unnoticed while others were accentuated. It was a whisper of a strategy not yet fully revealed. Returning to the drawing-room, she sat again, knitting in her lap, as the household gathered nearby. Edward had begun to ask questions about the cryptic note, his voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. Lady Ashworth, still pale and shaken, insisted it was likely nothing, a meaningless remnant of past correspondence. Mrs. Gray, escorted to her temporary quarters for questioning, had been unusually silent, eyes downcast, as if aware of secrets beyond even her own admissions. Miss Marple, with her calm, deliberate voice, addressed them all. It is important to recognize that mysteries once begun rarely conclude in perfect neatness. Even after confessions, even after patterns are revealed, subtle actions and cryptic details can persist, hinting at layers of human intention we may not yet fully understand. The note, the alignment in the hallway, and the behaviors observed, these are reminders that observation must continue, that insight must remain patient and vigilant. The household listened in tense silence, absorbing both the comfort of apparent resolution and the subtle unease of lingering ambiguity. Miss Marple allowed the pause to deepen, the silence amplifying her words without needing to speak further. It was the quiet, unspoken pressure of a detective's mind, alert to every nuance, every shadow, every tiny ripple of human behaviour. Edward Harrow finally broke the quiet. "Do you mean to say—" There might be another player involved. His voice was low, careful, and edged with a cautious hope that the worst was behind him. Miss Marple inclined her head slowly. "It is possible. What has been revealed accounts for most actions, most manipulations, most outcomes. But the smallest gestures, the subtle discrepancies, and even the cryptic notes may indicate influences that have yet to come fully into view. The human mind, when clever and determined, can leave traces that do not immediately align with observable motives, and it is those traces that must be considered if one wishes to truly understand what has occurred." A flicker of unease crossed Lady Ashworth's face. "Are you saying—" "The case isn't fully closed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, a calm yet knowing expression. "The case is resolved in its central urgent aspects. Justice has been delivered, the guilty have been identified, and harm has been contained. But the story of human intention, subtle manipulation, and hidden influence never truly ends. There will always be questions lingering in the margins, small details that hint at further intrigue, even after we think we have reached the conclusion." She paused, her gaze drifting to the fireplace where shadows danced softly. It is a reminder that in every household, every gathering, every quiet corridor, there exists the potential for unseen actions, for motives unexamined, and for consequences beyond our immediate perception. The lesson is not only to observe, but to continue to observe, to notice the faintest details, and to remain patient. The world is never entirely predictable, and neither are those who dwell within it. As she spoke, her eyes fell upon the crumpled note once more, left intentionally in the light, almost as if the universe, or perhaps the criminal mind, was teasing a final challenge. Miss Marple's fingers brushed it gently, smoothing the paper just enough to read the phrase clearly. "The game is never truly finished." A faint, knowing smile crossed her face. There was the satisfaction of closure, yet the thrill of anticipation remained. Human nature, after all, always promised another puzzle, another secret, another mystery just beyond the edges of perception. The household, reassured yet quietly aware of, lingering questions began to settle for the evening. Conversations were tentative, reflective, and careful, each person processing what had been revealed and what remained hidden. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, quietly observing the faint shifts in expression, the subtle exchanges of glance and gesture, cataloguing each for the future. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to depart, the soft click of her gloves, the gentle rustle of her coat, and the rhythmic sound of her knitting needles being put aside carried a calm finality. Yet in her mind the case was not fully closed. It would continue in the quiet corners, in the small details, in the faint traces of human intention left behind. She understood, as only a detective of her caliber could, that mysteries are never truly over. Each resolution is temporary, each confession a doorway to further observation, and every subtle detail a whisper of intrigue yet to come. Miss Marple paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time at Ashworth Manor. The shadows of the evening stretched long across the floors, the last light catching the subtle expressions of those who had been caught in the web of manipulation, fear, and revelation. She smiled faintly to herself. The central crime had been unravelled, justice had been measured, yet the faintest of threads hinted at new stories, new puzzles, and new lessons awaiting discovery. And with that quiet knowledge, she stepped into the cooling twilight, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly, a reminder that the mind attentive to human nature is never truly idle, and that even in conclusion, mystery endures.